Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Started. Folks, welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today we have a guest, Steve Chessin, and he's going to talk about proportional representation. So Steve, kindly give us an introduction to yourself and your organization.
Okay. Well, again, my name is Steve Chessin, and I'm co-president of Californians for Electoral Reform. I got interested actually in proportional representation when I was an undergraduate at MIT, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is at the time was the only city in the United States that was still using a proportional representation system to elect their city council. And the billboards, I wasn't a voter in Massachusetts, but the billboards around when the Cambridge City Council elections were happening would say things like vote Jane Doe #1 for city council. And I was kind of curious about what is this #1 business? I've never seen that on a billboard before. And I did a little bit of investigation and discovered that they used what was then called preference voting, what is now, I guess, being called proportional ranked choice voting, and what the political scientists call a single transferable vote to elect their city council. And that just seemed like a good idea to me. And then I did my graduate work at UC Berkeley. And there, the student government is also elected using the single transferable vote. And I got even more interested in it then. Fast forward to 1993. When I was listening to a radio program on the Pacifica station in Berkeley, California, KPFA, where some guy was talking about a movement that just had started called Citizens for Proportional Representation, ! A national organization that wanted to reintroduce proportional representation to people in the United States. Actually, proportional representation was used quite a bit in the first half of the 20th century to elect many city councils across the country. After World War II, red baiting and racism were used to drive the repeal efforts. We can go into that later if you want. Excuse me. Anyway, that really excited me that this organization was being formed. I discovered that there was a California chapter of it. The national organization changed its name at some point to the Center for Voting and Democracy, and later on to Fair Vote. The California organization changed its name from Citizens for Proportional Representation to Northern California Citizens for Proportional Representation, to what we're now called Californians for Electoral Reform. And part of that is because we also decided to support ranked choice voting for single winner elections. I joined that organization. I applied, tried to get on the board of directors in 94 and lost. In 95, I ran again for board of directors and won. I became the vice president for state and local campaigns. And then a few years later, the guy who founded the organization, who was also the president, decided to step away from that role, still stayed active with it. So I became the president or co-president and have been president or co-president of the organization ever since. So does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. That gives a good introduction to how you came into this reform movement. So sure. So kindly explain to our audience what proportional representation is. Many of our audience members are active in alternative parties or they support alternative parties, so they may have familiarity with it. In case they don't, and maybe in case they don't know everything, kindly explain what it is.
Sure. Well, the basic principles behind proportional representation is, or actually the basic principle is majority rule for fair representation for the electoral minority in direct proportion to how people vote. So if you belong to a like-minded block of the electorate that represents 60% of the vote, you should get 60% of the seats in the governing body, not all of them. And if you belong to a like-minded block of the electorate that represents 30% of the vote, you should get 30% of the seats, not nothing. So that's the basic principle. Do you have any questions up to this point?
No, that makes sense.
Okay. There are two key ingredients for all proportional representation systems. The first key ingredient is that instead of voting for a single candidate to represent, say, your district, you're voting for a list of candidates that are going to represent you in a multi-member district or jurisdiction wide or whatever. So that's the first key ingredient. You're voting for a list. In some systems, the political parties make up the lists and the voters get to choose. In other systems, each voter gets to make up their own list. But then the second key ingredient is that you don't allocate the winners in a winner-take-all fashion. You allocate the winners to the lists in direct proportion to how many votes a list gets. So the more votes a list gets, the more candidates from that list will be elected in direct proportion to how people vote. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, does that answer that question?
Yes, it does. I'm wondering about how it's determined how many votes a list gets.
Well, the simplest, and normally when I give this talk, I use, when we've got a video connection, I show actual sample ballots from actual jurisdictions that elect their legislatures using proportional representation. The simplest system is what's called party list. And this is used by many countries. South Africa, for example, when they abolished apartheid, they went from a single member district system like we use to a proportional system, a list system. And in a closed list system, each political party, in whatever manner they choose, draws up a list of candidates. And for example, say we're electing a 100-member parliament. And 100 members is too much to think of by any one person. So what we'll do is we'll divide the country into 10 regions, and each of those regions will elect 10 people. So in the region that I happen to live in, for example, one party, say the Purple Party, they'll have some kind of nominating convention, and they'll come up with a list of 10 candidates, and they'll order that list. So if they only get 10% of the vote, only the first person on their list will be elected in that region. And if they get 20% of the vote, then the first two people on that list will get elected, and so on. And then the Yellow Party will similarly draw up a list of 10 candidates, and every single party will draw up a list. If a party thinks that, well, we're a small party, we're never going to get more than 30% of the vote, they may only have a list with only, say, 3, 4, or 5 people on it, but that's okay. Then on election day, I will get a ballot which will list the political parties. Each party will presumably publish somehow what their list is, so I know who's on that list, so I can use that when I'm deciding which party do I want to vote for. For example, I may like the Yellow Party, but I might discover that, my goodness, they're just nominating men. There's no women on their list. Well, I'm not going to vote for a party that doesn't nominate women, so I may look at a different party that has both men and women on their list, and then I'll cast my vote for that party. So I'll make whatever decision I want as to which party I'm going to vote for. And then all the votes in that region are tallied. And for every 10% of the vote that a party gets, they will get one person off of their list to fill one of those 10 seats. And there's various ways to deal with the fractions. I'm not going to go into that now, but conceptually, I think you and the listeners will understand how a closed list system works.
Okay, so is it you're voting by party then, and then the parties determine which of the candidates you go for, or is there a system where you can vote for particular candidates? I know some people who have reservations with the Democratic Party, maybe they're really leftist, but they may like some of the candidates who are more on the border, the more progressive candidates. So how does that work in situations like that?
Right. Well, that's similar to there's many systems where you get to vote for candidates. I'll go to the next system, which is called open party list. This is what Denmark uses, for example. And when you get your ballot, it doesn't just list the parties that have nominated 10 candidates or that have a list in that region. That list, that the ballot will also include the names of those candidates. And I can choose not only the party I want to vote for, but the candidate I want to vote for in that party. And so I will put my check mark next to a particular name in a particular party. And what that does is, in terms of determining how many seats each party gets, again, say if the yellow party gets 40% of all the votes for their candidates, that accounts for 40% of the vote, they'll get 4 of those 10 seats. And if the purple party gets 30% of the vote, then they'll get 3 of those seats. But then you look at how many votes did each candidate in the yellow party get. You order their list by the amount of votes that they got. So if the yellow party is only going to get 4 seats, then the top 4 vote getters within the yellow party's list will get those 4 seats. And that's called open list. And that gives the voters a little bit of control over which of the party's candidates actually get to fill the seats. So that's a variation on the list system. There's another system that's a little bit more sophisticated. It's called the Mixed Member Proportional System, or MMP. And this is what's used in Germany and New Zealand and Austria, Mexico, Venezuela, Bolivia, Hungary. I think that may be the entire list of countries that use the mixed member proportional system. And the way that works, in that region, I said that's going to elect 10 people. We're going to divide that region into 5 single member districts. So 5 of the seats are going to get allocated by district, and the other 5 are going to be region wide. And my ballot on election day will have 2 columns. And one column will list all the candidates who are running for my district. And the other column will list all the parties that are competing for the regional seats, the 5 regional seats in that 10-member region. And it's not required that every party competing for the regional seats also have a candidate competing for a district seat. You know, a party may be a small party, and they may be able to find 5 people to run for the regional seat, but in my particular district, they can't find anybody to run. So on election day, I get to vote for the person that I want to represent my district, and I also get to vote for the party that I'd like to represent the region. And there's no requirement that the person I vote for to represent the district also belongs to the party that I vote to represent the region. I can split my vote if I want. And typically, they use plurality to decide who gets the district seats, but it could be ranked choice voting. And they will also look at how many votes each party gets on the regional portion of the ballot to determine the total number of seats they should get. So, for example, suppose the yellow party gets 40% of the vote on the regional ballot. So they're entitled to get a total of 4 seats, but they only elect 1 person from a district. Well, then they get to get 3 of the regional seats so that they get the total of 4 that they're entitled to. Similarly, if the purple party also gets 40% of the vote, and they happen to elect 3, win the seats of 3 districts, well, they're entitled to 4 seats, so they will get 1 of the regional seats to get their total of 4, since they got 40% of the vote. So in the mixed member proportional system, again, half the seats are elected from single member districts, and half the seats are elected region wide. But the seats in the region are allocated in what's called a compensatory fashion to compensate for the fact that single member district elections are not proportional at all. So that's a little bit more sophisticated than the open and closed list systems. And then the most sophisticated system is the one where voters make up their own lists. This is the single transferable vote, or the proportional ranked choice voting system that Cambridge, Massachusetts uses. And one advantage of this system is you'll notice that in both the open and closed list systems and the mixed member proportional, I talked about political parties. The proportional ranked choice voting system works with both partisan and nonpartisan elections. The city council race in Cambridge, Massachusetts is nonpartisan. There are no party affiliations listed to candidates' names on the ballot. In California, for example, where I live, all local elections are by law nonpartisan. So when you're voting for school board or city council or county board of supervisors, those are all nonpartisan elections. It's only when you get to voting for the state legislature and higher offices, state offices and federal offices, that those are partisan elections where people have their party affiliation next to their name on the ballot.
There are a lot of different options for proportional representation. There's those, if I heard you right, there's 4 different options that you have presented. So we have a lot of choices. Shall we adopt proportional representation? So it looks like there's 4 different options.
Right. I'm going to, as soon as I finish drinking my water, I'm going to go into more detail about the single transfer vote system.
Okay. So you're going to elaborate on that some more.
Yes, because I think it's important that your listeners understand how these systems work.
Okay.
Now, in the proportional ranked choice voting system, you have a list of candidates, and just like in single winner ranked choice voting, the voter experience is very simple. They put the number 1 next to their first choice, the person they'd most like to see elected to represent their area. They put a number 2 next to their second choice, a 3 next to their third choice, a 4 next to the fourth choice, and so on down the ballot. But unlike a single winner system where only one person is going to be elected, we're going to actually elect more than one person in this fashion. Now let's take the city of Cambridge. They elect a 9-member city council using this system. And you may have upwards of 20 people on the ballot because there tend to be 2 particular factions in Cambridge, plus a bunch of independents running. So you will get upwards of 20 people on the ballot, but you don't have to rank all 20. You can rank the average number of candidates that people rank is about 5. A lot of people, maybe 70% of the people, will actually rank at least 9 candidates. There will be a few people who will rank everybody. Anyway, the first thing you have to do in a proportional ranked choice voting system is establish what's called a threshold of election. How many votes does a candidate need in order to be guaranteed a seat? And it's best to explain this with actual numbers. So let's assume that 10,000 people have voted in the election, and we're going to elect 9 seats. Well, the way we establish a threshold of election is we want to come up with a number where no more than 9 people can have that number of votes, and there wouldn't be enough left over for a 10th person to have that number. And the way you get this mathematically is you take the number of votes, 10,000 in this case, you divide it by 1 more than the number of seats. There are 9 seats. We add 1, that's 10. 10,000 divided by 10 is 1,000. And then we add 1. And that makes the threshold of election 1,001 votes. Because if 9 people each get 1,001 votes when we sort the ballots out by first choice, if 9 people each get 1,001 votes, that's 9,009 votes. And that leaves a remainder from the 10,000 of only 899 or 999. Anyway, but it's not enough. It's not over this 1,001 threshold. It isn't enough to elect a 10th person. So that establishes the threshold of election. So then we sort the ballots out by first choice, and any candidate who has the number of votes equal to or greater than the threshold of election is elected. Now, let's say Mary is so popular that 4,004 people have ranked her as their first choice. Well, if those 4,004 people could have gotten into a room before the election, they could say, well, gee, we have 4,004 people. We have enough voters to elect 4 people because the threshold is only 1,001. So why don't you 1,001 people, you put Mary down as your first choice, and you 1,001 put Bob down as your first choice, and you 1,001 put down Jill as your first choice, and you 1,001 put down Jose as your first choice. But they didn't do that. Instead, for simplicity, let's say they just ranked Mary first, Bob second, Jill third, and Jose fourth. Well, so that we don't disenfranchise this block of voters that's entitled to 4 seats. And since Mary got 4 times as many votes as she needed to be elected, she gets to keep the 1,001 votes that she needed to be elected, but we take the other 3,003 votes that she got, and we'll give those to the second choice on each of those 3,003 voters' ballots. And if they all rank Bob second, then those 3,000 votes will go to Bob. He now has 3 times as many votes as he needs to be elected. So he keeps 1,001, and the 2,002 remainder go to the next choice on each of those voters' ballots. And that would elect Jill. She now has twice as many. So she keeps 1,001, and the remaining 1,001 go to the next person, which would be Jose. And now Jose is elected, and he keeps 1,001. There's no more votes to be transferred. So that block of voters has elected the 4 people they're entitled to voting. And even though I had them ranking those 4 candidates in that order, it doesn't actually really require that. As long as 4,004 voters rank Mary, Bob, Jill, and Jose as their first 4 choices in any order, those 4 people are guaranteed to be elected. And it also works if there's a group of voters that can only elect 1 person, but they split their votes among too many candidates. Just like with single winner ranked choice voting, you take the person who has the fewest votes and they get eliminated, and the people who voted for that person get their votes transferred to their next choice. And those votes will bubble up until they land on someone who now has more than 1,001 votes, and that person will win a seat. So this is the most sophisticated system, and it results in the majority block of voters electing a majority of the seats, but not all of them. And it also allows a minority of the voters to elect their fair share of representation, not nothing. And like I said, it's the most sophisticated of the system, and if you go to fairvote.org or cfer.org, or just do a web search on proportional ranked choice voting or single transferable vote, or even STV in Wikipedia, you'll find written explanations of that system. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes. So it sounds like these often go hand in hand with ranked choice voting.
The proportional ranked choice voting version definitely does.
Okay, so some of them do go hand in hand with ranked choice voting.
That one does. Now, there are other systems that people are inventing all the time. It's been mathematically proven that there's no such thing as a perfect electoral system. If there was, we'd all be using it. But because there is no perfect electoral system, I like to compare perfect electoral systems to perpetual motion machines because they don't exist. But just like people are trying to invent perpetual motion machines all the time, there are people who are trying to invent perfect voting systems all the time as well.
Okay.
But the ones I described are ones that are actually used in public elections. Proportional ranked choice voting is used by the Republic of Ireland to elect their lower house of parliament. And it's also used by the country of Australia to elect their upper house, the Australian Senate. And some of the Australian states also use it to elect their lower house. And many cities in New Zealand also have adopted proportional ranked choice voting for their local governments.
So what are the benefits of proportional representation?
Well, the main benefit of proportional representation is it gives you fair representation. For one thing, more women are elected to houses of parliament in countries that use proportional systems than countries that don't. And if this was a visual podcast, I could show you the bar graph that illustrates that. And if you think about it, if you remember the party list system I described, where I gave the example of I wasn't going to vote for a party that only had men on their list, it behooves a party, even under a list system, to put women on their list so that they will be more attractive to women voters and to male voters who like to support parties that are gender balanced. So you'll get that. You'll get the same thing with ethnicity. If you belong to a particular ethnic group and ethnic identity is important to you as a factor, then you're more likely to vote for a party that has people who represent your ethnicity on their list. And we can actually take a look at like, for example, the New York City school boards. New York City, before Mayor Bloomberg abolished them in, I think, the 1990s, used to have these 9-member community school boards all throughout the city that elected the school board members using the same system that Cambridge, Massachusetts uses, same systems, proportional ranked choice voting that I described earlier. And if you look at a 20-year period from the 1970s to the 1990s, as the ethnic balance of New York City changed, and as more Asian Americans, for example, that percentage of the population increased, you will see that organically more Asian Americans got elected to the school boards. Women tended to get half of the seats over that 20-year period. And the ethnic balance of those school boards tended to track the ethnic balance of the population as a whole as it changed over time. And another example I use in my talks is Cincinnati, Ohio, which also used that system from the 1920s through the 1950s. And as the African American population increased, when it got over that 10% threshold that it would need to win a seat on a 9-member city council, the African American population was able to elect somebody. And then as they got closer to 20%, they were able to elect 2 people. And it wasn't until the white majority decided they didn't want African Americans on the city council, so they abolished that system and reverted it to a plurality system where every voter gets 9 votes and the top 9 vote getters win. And the white majority got all the seats and the black population couldn't elect anybody. And it wasn't until they changed later on to a district system that the black population was actually able to elect somebody to the city council. So proportional systems organically track changes in the demographics of the population without the need to arbitrarily draw gerrymandered single-member districts. So that's, to me, that's the major advantage of proportional systems. You also get higher turnout because if you think about it, in a single winner system, full disclosure, I'm a registered Democrat. And I live in Santa Clara County. And our county is covered by 6 assembly districts. And each of those assembly districts elects a Democrat. So Santa Clara County is represented by 6 assembly people in the state legislature, all of whom are Democrats. But if you look at the way people vote on election day, 1/3 of the county votes for the Republican candidates. So they're denied their fair share of representation. And if we had a proportional system, then 2 of those assembly people would be Republican and 4 of those assembly people would be Democrats, and that'd be fair. Now, another reason why I say drives turnout, since I live in a safe Democratic area, if for some reason I can't get to the polls on election day because my kid is sick or my car's in the shop or there's an emergency at work, well, I know the person I like is going to be elected. And so it's okay if I miss the election. Similarly, my Republican neighbor, well, they know the person that they like is not going to win. So if they can't get to the polls on election day, it doesn't really matter because, again, the threshold of election is 50%. Pretty much, and if the place is 60% Democrat, then it doesn't really matter. But on a proportional system, which has a much lower threshold, Well, now if you're talking about, it's the difference between 9% and 11% to elect somebody. Well, gee, my vote's going to count. It's more likely that I could push the threshold, even if it's between 59% and 61% to elect an additional person. Well, I'm going to be more motivated to vote than if it's than if the threshold's 50% to elect one person and 60% of the people are going to vote one way. Because I'm still going to be helping to elect someone to represent my point of view, either one more person in the majority or one more person in the minority, doesn't really matter. My vote will count more in a proportional system than it would in a winner-take-all system. As a matter of fact, that's one reason why even I think the major parties could benefit from a proportional system, because there would be no blue areas and red areas. They'd all be various shades of purple. And so there'd be representatives each area. When I talk to partisan groups, major party groups in California, I talk about how there'd be no orphan Democrats in the red parts of the state and no orphan Republicans in the blue parts of the state, that they would all have someone who would represent them in the state legislature. And in parts of the state, like in San Francisco, where liberal third parties or alternative parties are very strong, you might even get a Green represented elected to a legislative position. And in parts of the state where the Libertarian Party is very strong, you could get a Libertarian elected to the state legislature.
So since you mentioned that you're a registered Democrat and you talked about being a part of the Democratic Party, are there a fair number of people who are also Democrats that support this, or are you an exception to the general consensus among the party?
I am a member of a small minority. As a matter of fact, the California Democratic Party adopted a resolution a few years ago supporting the use of proportional representation for local elections. I tried to get them to pass a resolution 20 years ago. Actually, maybe it's getting on to, about 20 years ago, supporting proportional representation for the partisan elections. And they weren't willing to do that, but they did ask me to commission a study as to what that would do to the, to the representation in Congress. And I did that. And I had the political science department at San Francisco State University, got them to do some simulated simulations. And it really didn't change. The simulation showed that it didn't really change very much what the congressional representation would be. It just shifted it. So like I said, there'd be no solid blue and solid red parts of the state. They'd all be various shades of purple. And depending upon what threshold you established, at the time we had 52 members of Congress. And if you elected them all statewide, which would get the threshold very low, that opened the potential for third parties or alternative parties to elect representation. But if you kept the threshold very high, so that if, for example, you elected from 4-member districts, 13 4-member districts, so the threshold of election would be about 20%, that would be a very high barrier for the alternative parties to get elected. So again, it depends upon what you establish. Now, there is nothing in the US Constitution that makes it illegal to use proportional representation to elect members of Congress. There is a federal law. It's 2 United States Code 2C, 2 USC 2C, that establishes single member districts for congressional elections. And there actually has been a bill introduced in Congress, the Fair Representation Act, that would mandate that states use proportional ranked choice voting to elect their members of Congress from 3 to 5 member districts, with a preference given to 5-member districts for those states that had at least 5 representatives. And with a 5-member district, then your threshold of election is about 17%. And so again, areas where alternative parties are strong, they could breach that barrier. But again, the main accomplishment is it would get rid of pure red and pure blue districts. Every district would be some shade of purple.
Okay. So who introduced that bill?
That was introduced, oh gosh, give me a moment. I'll bring it up on my website in a browser. I think it was, I want to say, I don't want to get the guy's name wrong. I should have brought this up before.
That's okay.
Yeah, maybe you can edit out the pause.
It makes me curious because I wouldn't have expected that. I don't hear too much about that being introduced. So whoever did that, they deserve a lot of credit.
Yeah, it's HR 3863. And it was introduced by Representative Don Bayer from Virginia. 7 co-sponsors. And as soon as the tab loads, I can tell you who they are and where they're from. Let me sort this list by state. Okay. We've got Representative Ro Khanna and Scott Peters from California, Joe Neguse from Colorado, Jamie Raskin from Maryland, James McGovern from Massachusetts, Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, and Jim Cooper from Tennessee. They're all Democrats. There are no Republican co-sponsors of this bill. And I recommend to your listeners that they contact the Congress, no matter what party they are, and ask them to please become of HR 3863.
Okay.
Because that would establish, would require states that elect more than one member of Congress to use a proportional system, to use proportional ranked choice voting to elect their members. States that only elect one person would use the single winner version of ranked choice voting. It also establishes, even though proportional representation makes gerrymandering a lot less effective, it would also require states to use an independent redistricting commission to draw the district lines. You know, states that had more than 6 or more members of Congress would use multi-member districts, and someone would have to draw that line. And like I said, proportional representation makes it a lot harder to do gerrymandering because it raises what I call the threshold of control for drawing those districts, but it still requires the independent redistricting, which is a good thing. You really don't want the politicians choosing their voters before the voters go to the polls to choose their elected officials.
Sure. So kindly briefly touch on the part you mentioned about how it was red baiting played a role in this. We had a Socialist Party chair on one of our episodes mention that. I didn't come across the theory about how they could use that to suppress alternative parties in general. So kindly discuss how they use red baiting in regards to proportional representation.
Right. In New York City used to use the proportional ranked choice voting method to elect the New York City Council. And this was in the first half of the 20th century. And a socialist got elected to the city council. I don't remember what year this was, but the New York City has partisan local elections. And the New York Times published an editorial about how that socialist acted as a moderating influence between the Democratic and the Republican factions on the city council, how he was able to talk to both sides and come up with compromises that they could both live with, that both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, could live with. And if you'll remember, during World War II, the Russians were an ally of ours in the fight against Germany. But after World War II, with the rise of McCarthy and the Red Scare in the United States, all of a sudden, being a socialist was considered evil. And the New York Times editorialized that something had to be done to get rid of the socialist off the New York City Council. So the New York State Legislature passed a law banning the use of proportional ranked choice voting to elect city councils. And in other parts of the country where socialists or leftists had been elected, the conservative majorities, again, used red baiting. We got to get rid of these socialist legislators to repeal proportional ranked choice voting. I use the example of Cincinnati, where African Americans had gotten elected. In Cincinnati, the tradition was, like I said, you sort the ballots out by first choice, and anybody gets over the threshold of election is elected, and then you transfer any surplus ballots that they have. Cincinnati had this tradition that when you got the 9 winners at the end of the tally, whichever one of those winners received the most first choices in the first round of tallying, the city council would elect that person as mayor. The city council chose the mayor, but the tradition was that person would become mayor. And so when in the early 50s, African Americans were electing 1 and sometimes 2 people to the city council, a rumor was started, and one of those black members had been consistently elected. And so rumor was started that the African American population, they were all going to rank that one person in the next election. I think that was in the 57 election. So he got elected in 55, 2 got elected in 55. So in the 57 election, the African American population was organizing. They were organizing 2 years in advance, that they were all going to rank that person first. So he would become the mayor, and Cincinnati would have a black mayor. And this was anathema to the white conservative majority. About that time, Cleveland was about 75% white and 25% African American. So the white majority put a ballot measure on the 1956 ballot to repeal proportional ranked choice voting and replace it with a plurality system, block vote. You vote for 9 candidates, and the top 9 vote getters win. And that passed 75 to 25%. And again, using racism as the motivating driver. We don't want African Americans to take over the city council, so let's prevent them from being elected. And that passed, and in the 1957 election, no African Americans were elected. And the same thing happened in the 4 other cities in Ohio that used proportional ranked choice voting. There were other cities, I was told recently, that Boulder, Colorado used to use proportional ranked choice voting to elect their city council until it was repealed. And you can look at all the various cities that used it, and either, depending upon again, all politics is local, and depending whether it was ethnic minorities or political minorities that got elected, the majoritarian establishments didn't like the fact that minority voices were getting seats, that they had to listen. They didn't have to, even though they had the majority of the council, they didn't have to vote for any of the minority proposals, but they had to listen to them. And they didn't even want to listen to them. So they basically used various forms, again, according to the local situation, either red baiting or racism or both, to drive the repeal efforts. So that after the late 50s, the only place where proportional ranked choice voting was being used was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Until recently, when Minneapolis adopted single winner ranked choice voting for their city council a few years ago, they adopted ranked choice voting for all of their elections and for their park board and another board. I think it might be the library board. There's certain seats that they elect, 2 seats at large. So that became proportional ranked choice voting. So that reappeared, but not as a city council. The first city councils that will use proportional ranked choice voting besides Cambridge will be in 2022. Albany, California, just passed a charter amendment. Actually, no, they did by ordinance. Anyway, they passed a ballot measure to switch to proportional ranked choice voting for their city council beginning in 2022. And a court settlement of a California Voting Rights Act lawsuit will result in the city of Palm Desert electing 1 city council member from a single member district using ranked choice voting, and 4 city council members elected 2 each cycle using proportional ranked choice voting. So we'll see that in 2022 as well. And I expect to see more and more cities, movements in more and more cities around the country to adopt proportional ranked choice voting during the next few years.
So is that your strategy to implementing PRs, doing it at a local level?
Yeah. My belief, shared by many people, is that we need to have local examples of it working to get people used to the concept before people are willing to try it on the statewide level or at the national level. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't, that I want to discourage people from trying it at the statewide level. What we're seeing mainly being tried at the statewide level is single winner ranked choice voting, like was recently adopted in the state of Maine, which applies to their federal elections and state offices in the primaries. Their state constitution actually uses the word plurality for state offices, and the courts have held that ranked choice voting is not a plurality method, so they can't use it in the general election, but they can use it in the primary elections. Massachusetts had a measure on the ballot to go to statewide ranked choice voting that narrowly lost. Again, I think they need more local examples of it in Massachusetts. It's only being used, ranked choice voting is only being used in Cambridge, the proportional method. They need to have more examples of both single and multi-winner ranked choice voting being used in other parts of the state to get people comfortable with ranking candidates. Establishing at the local level does a couple of things. And this gets to do, well, where does the opposition to proportional representation come from? Or to ranked choice voting come from? And opposition comes from 3 main sources. One is the elected officials themselves, because they know how to win elections under the current rules, and they're not sure how to win elections if you change the rules. Related to that are their campaign consultants, because they also know how to campaign under the current rules. And if you change the rules, you take away some of their tools and they have to learn new ones, and they don't like that. And then a third source of opposition are the election officials, the people who conduct the elections. I've been a poll worker and what we call a field inspector, somebody who supports a bunch of polling places on election day. And I'm on the Santa Clara County Citizens Advisory Commission on Elections. We provide oversight to the Registrar of Voters office. So I know elections are a very complicated process. Conducting an election and doing it properly, it's very complicated. It's been described as you're producing a Broadway show that only performs for one night. And you want to have a flawless performance on that one night. And the people who do those elections or are in charge are very reluctant to take on something different, which gives them an opportunity to screw things up. And if they're appointed, it means that they could get fired if they mess things up. In California, some registrars are elected, but most are appointed. We find the ones that are elected are actually more open to trying new things because they're responsible to the voters. And even if they mess things up a little bit, as long as they recover, they can usually get themselves reelected. But the ones who are appointed, if they mess things up, they usually get fired. So it takes a very brave registrar to be willing to try new things. It has to be mandated by the state, or it has to be mandated by the board of supervisors. So they have political cover. Well, I had to do this because I was told I had to, and we messed up. Well, they didn't give us enough time to implement it. They didn't give us enough resources. They didn't give us enough money. So it's not my fault. So one of the biggest sources of opposition to ranked choice voting in California, for example, has come from the California Association of Clerks and Elected Officials, which is the organization that represents all of the election officials in California that at the county level that conduct elections. Now, that was 10 years ago. They've tempered. They are now more or less neutral on it. I think they recognize that it's happening, and they've seen ranked choice voting being used since 2003 in San Francisco, and since 2010 in Alameda, 3 cities in Alameda County. And they see that it's being used very successfully. And while there were a few attempts to try to repeal it, those attempts were unsuccessful. And so, and the voting equipment vendors now all support ranked choice voting, and some even support proportional ranked choice voting. So they see it's coming, and they've tempered. They're no longer blanketly opposed to it. They don't necessarily support it, but they basically say that, if the voters adopt it in a jurisdiction, then yes, we will do what we can to make it successful.
All right. So kindly explain what your organization does and how our audience can support your organization.
All right. Well, our organization, Californians for Electoral Reform, we do educational and advocacy work around proportional representation and also the single winner form of ranked choice voting. We give talks when there's a ballot measure or a city council effort to adopt ranked choice voting. We will go in and educate people if there's a measure on the ballot. We can't parachute in and get something passed, but if there are people on the ground, we will do what we can to support them, whether that's helping them raise money or helping them develop literature. And so if you go to our organization, to our website, CFER, C as in California, F as in 4, E as in electoral, R as in reform, Californians for Electoral Reform, CFER.org. You can sign up on our email list. You could also become a paid member. Paid members get to vote in our board of directors elections. Associate or non-paid members do not. But that's basically the only difference. And we will let you know what's happening. There's also a movement that's about to be launched in California, the California Ranked Choice Voting Coalition, which CFER is a member of that coalition, but other groups, Level Up, I think Represent Us, a number of groups, and it's going to be officially launched in September. I'm not sure when this podcast is going to be available, maybe prior to our launch or after that launch. But we will have information on our website about it, and we will also send information to our email lists about that. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. I'm not that social media savvy. I'm an older person, but we do have some people who are a little bit more media savvy than me. And so we'll put information out on our Twitter account and our Facebook page. And there are links to that from our webpage as well. So people can find that. But joining our organization definitely helps. Being a paid member helps to pay for our website, helps to pay for our voicemail, because we do occasionally get phone calls. And just helps us keep the organization running. We do have a fairly low budget, about $5,000 a year. We don't have deep pockets. Our standard membership rate is $25 a year, but we do have a low income rate of $6 a year. And again, like I said, you can sign up for free and be on our email list, and you can follow us uh, on Twitter, and you can like us on Facebook as well.
So your website is, what's the address for our audience?
C as in Charlie, F as in Frank, E as in elephant, R as in reform, .org.
Okay, excellent. So Steve, we thank you for your time today, giving us a lot of fascinating information about proportional representation.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope it's fun for your audience, that they find it both enjoyable as well as educational. I realize that, I didn't get to answer all of the topics that you had suggested we cover. I'd be happy to come back for a second time if you want to do that, if that works out for you.
That is good. We did discuss a lot of it, so I appreciate your answers and your explanation of this important matter.
Thank you very much.
Have yourself a great day and all the best to you and your organization.
Thanks. You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.